Hi, Jim. Hope the situation in Utah is getting better. I assume it is, as this is probably going to air later on. I had a question about contributing to a non-governmental 457. I was wondering if there's any resources or should you Benjamin Graham it when you're thinking about actually contributing to your non-governmental 457? Is there maybe also a resource similar to Benjamin Graham's security analysis when it comes to actually evaluating whether you should contribute to a non-governmental 457? Or even if the same principles of security analysis will go into contributing. I know that the 457 non-governmental that's available has a triple B bond rating, investment grade. So is that enough? Or are there any other resources that you should look at or any other financials that you should evaluate in the hospital system and the employer to see how secure the non-governmental 457 is? Thanks so much.
Some of you might not have any idea what he's talking about. A 457 is tax-deferred compensation. It is money from your employer that basically they don't give to you now. They will give to you at some later date. A lot of times, however, they put it into an account that you can actually control the investments on. So it's kind of like a 401k that way. The contribution amount is exactly the same as your employee contribution to your 401k, although the catch-up contributions work a little bit differently. And then you can control the investments, and then you can decide when you take the money out later. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind with it. The first is you want to make sure the investments are good. If they're just absolutely terrible investments, you may not want to use much of the 457. The second thing you want to look at, whether it's a governmental or a non-governmental 457, is what the options are to get the money out. With a governmental one, a lot of times you can just roll it into a 401k or an IRA. With a non-governmental one, that is not an option. So you really want to look carefully at what the withdrawal options are. Sometimes they make it you take it all out in the year you leave your employer, which is obviously less than ideal. Sometimes you can spread it out over 5 years. Sometimes you can spread it out as long as you want. Sometimes you can wait 10 years and then you got to take it all out. But understand the options and make sure there's an acceptable one in there to you. That's really, really important to understand. The third thing is the one that this whole question is revolving around. With a governmental 457, essentially it's backed by the government. With a non-governmental 457, it's backed by your employer. So it's really good for your asset protection. If you get sued, they can't take your 457 money. But it's subject to the creditors of your employer. So if your hospital goes bankrupt, you could lose the 457 if it's a non-governmental 457. So this is the big risk, right? You defer all this compensation, then all of a sudden they go out of business and you don't get that compensation. So that's obviously a bad thing. So you want to make sure your employer is very stable before you take a 457 like this, before you use a 457 like this, at least in any significant way. If the hospital seems to be going out of business, maybe you don't want to use it at all. Maybe you don't want to run that risk. Just invest in a taxable account. It's not that big of a deal. So what's Ricky talking about? He's talking about trying to evaluate the stability of your employer. And that's a pretty hard thing to do, especially if you're going to be there long term, right? Because their fortunes today may not be the same as their fortunes in 15 or 20 years. And so I think the way most people do this is they just kind of ballpark it. If they're hearing rumblings about the hospital going out of business, or they know that the hospital is not being run very well, they just avoid the 457, or they just put a little bit of money into it. Maybe you contribute for 2 or 3 or 4 years, but you don't contribute for 15 years, for instance, because then you'd have a really big 457 in there. But I don't think there's any necessarily right answer to trying to do a heavy duty analysis on the value of your employer today, because it may change in 5 or 10 years. Certainly you could dive into that. I think if you're that worried about it, you probably ought to just limit how much you put into your 457. Maybe instead of putting in $19,500 a year, you put in $5,000 a year, and you invest the rest in a taxable account just to hedge against that possibility of them going out of business. I don't know that I would necessarily try to get all the financial statements for the hospital and pour through them before deciding whether to keep it or not. You're not buying the hospital, but all you have, it really doesn't depend on their success whether you get your money. All they have to do is stay in business, which is a much lower mark than whether they're going to be a successful investment on their own, which is really what a Benjamin Graham style security analysis would teach you how to do. Hope that's helpful to you. If you want your questions answered by the White Coat Investor, record your question at whitecoatinvestor.com/YQA or click the link in the description.